You are watching a teaching session from Church on the Move's Bible study, Genesis, a Book of Beginnings, Part 1. Now, this is the last step in a 3-part learning process that's accompanied by individual study and group discussion. So we have a study guide to go along with this. If you would like a copy of that study guide, email us at bible@churchonthemove.com. Now, grab a pen, your Bible, a notebook, the study guide, and let's get started. All right, well, hey everybody. So kind of wrap up the discussions that you're having right now. We're going to jump in. We're going to talk about some of the questions that you answered this week in your study guide. But first we're going to do a brief review but first of all, how are you guys feeling? How's everyone feeling? I got some woos over here. Feel good? So good. I see a thumbs up. I'm really excited. How about this table back here? More thumbs up. I'm thrilled. Okay, so we are going to jump right in with a quick review. So who can tell me, who wrote Genesis? Who wrote Moses. Okay, so some people believe that Moses had help in writing Genesis and the first 5 books of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, that we call the Pentateuch or the Torah, but so scribes or other contributors. But whether he wrote the whole thing or whether he had a strong editorial influence throughout, we attribute the first 5 books of the Bible to Moses. So, and Jesus, when he is talking to the 2 guys on the road to Emmaus, he says, "You've read Moses and the prophets." So he ascribes those first 5 books of the Bible to Moses as well. So who was it written to? Does anybody remember who it's written to? The Israelites. Yep. So the Israelites coming out of Egypt. So yes, there is an oral tradition that's passed down from generation to generation, but the primary audience in this ancient narrative is the Israelites who were emerging from slavery and were going to be entering into the promised land. So we're going to talk a little bit about a term that you might be familiar with tonight. It's a worldview. Who thinks that they know, if I say the word worldview, you kind of understand what I'm talking about? I see a few tiny nods. You might, so I think that's kind of a word that we take for granted. We assume that we know what it means, but a worldview is the way that a cultural group orders and makes sense of life and experience by asking the following questions. They ask 5 questions. So they ask, who are we? And in our current individualistic cultural narrative, someone might come asking, who am I? They ask, where are we? And someone again might ask, where am I? And then the third question is, they ask, what is the problem? And then they ask, what is the solution? And finally, they ask, where are we located in the story, or where am I located in the story? What's my part to play? So this just tells us that humanity is wired up to look for meaning and purpose. And Genesis does answer all of these questions, but begins by answering a preliminary question that lays the foundation and sets the trajectory. That's a hard word, y'all. Trajectory for the remainder of the book and the biblical story. So, what are the questions that Genesis is trying to answer? This is really important. And the first question that Genesis is trying to answer is this: what is God's relationship to the world? What is God's relationship to the world? And then, and only then, does it try to answer the question, what is humanity's relationship to God and the world? So, what Genesis 1 is offering us is an ancient cosmology. There's another word that we might kind of take for granted and assume that we know the meaning of. So cosmology is this: it's an account of the origins of the universe as humans experience it. Cosmology, here's the definition again. It's an account of the origins of the universe as humans experience it. So Hebrew cosmology is in dialogue with other ancient Near Eastern cosmologies like Egypt and Babylon. So Israel is an ancient cosmology, and it is in dialogue with other ancient cosmologies that have similarities to this narrative. So it's in dialogue with those, but what it is not in dialogue with is our scientific understanding of how the universe was created. So it is not in dialogue with that. And many times that is the meaning that we import upon the text. That's the way that we approach the text, but that is not what this text is dealing with. So we're going to do a quick recap of verse 1 before we jump into the rest of the text. So you see, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And last week we talked about how it could be paraphrased as when God created what's up there and what's down here. And in other words, you could say this in simpler terms, because earth we automatically, in our post-enlightenment understanding of that the world is round, a better way to phrase that might be land, and a better way to talk about heavens might be sky. So in the beginning, God created the skies and the land. So you have this word beginning. In Hebrew, it's reshit. It refers not to a first point in time, but to a preliminary period of time. In other words, this is talking about the beginning of the process. This first verse is a summary prologue. So it's saying in the beginning, when everything got started, and then it's going to give you an explanation or exposition of that prologue. So it's summarizing everything that's about to unfold. So remember that first question that Genesis is answering? What is God's relationship to the world? Well, verse 1 of the Bible sets the stage for what the whole Bible is about. The Bible is about God who chooses to reveal himself to people. We see him because he wants us to see him. We know him because he wants us to know him. So the scriptures reveal from the very beginning that God is a living and personal God. He is the most high God, the creator and sovereign of all that is. And everything that is because of God. I'll say that again, everything that is because of God. So his ways are perfect and they are purposeful and they are moving towards a desired end. Okay, so that's verse 1. Let's jump into verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So you did a little exercise in your study guide where you described the terms without form and void in your own words. And you were encouraged to look at various translations. So I'm wondering, what did some of you see? What are some words that you came up with that are different from, or a different way of explaining without form and void? Anyone? No rhyme or reason, that's good. No shape. I heard something over here. Darkness. A blob. I actually really like that. I think of Jell-O, maybe. Yes? Unfinished and unfilled. That's very good. Okay, one more over here I heard. Vanity. Purposelessness. That's kind of where my mind tends to go. Okay. Vast. Matt, did you have your raw material? These are all incredible answers. This is awesome. So the Hebrew phrase here is tohu vavohu, and it's best translated wild and waste. Or we could say the earth had no defined purpose and it lacked substance. So what we're going to see in the first 6 days of creation is how God takes what is formless and empty and forms and fills it. So think formless and empty, and then he forms and fills. Okay, so in all ancient Near Eastern creation narratives, Egypt, Babylon, and Israel, there are two common themes for pre-creation, and they are night and waters. You had another question about that in your study guide. So we have night or darkness over the chaotic waters in this verse. So these two images are crucial to understanding how God is ordering creation. There is another image that would have come to the ancient Near Eastern mind of what would mean chaos, what would mean desolate, wasteland, uninhabitable. So if you're in Israel and you have this fertile land in the center and you have the Mediterranean Sea on one side, what's on the other side? That would be uninhabitable. What's on the other side? There's desert. There's desert on the other side. So the word tohu, this is closely associated with wilderness or desolate. So for the ancient Israelites, you would have had an understanding of both of these ideas of these are uninhabitable places. So in English we have, and then we're going to think about, so we understand this tohu vavohu, but then you have the Spirit hovering over the face of the deep. In English, we have three words for the Hebrew word for spirit, and it's ruach. Ruach. So you kind of get that something in the back of your throat there. So we have three words. We say breath, spirit, or wind. Then we read that the Spirit is hovering over the face of the waters. This phrase depicts intimate involvement God had in creation. If you put your hand in front of your face, go like this with me. If you put your hand in front of your face, hopefully you can, maybe you need to check your breath a little bit, but hopefully you can feel yourself breathing. And then if you speak, say ruach, you can feel it that much more. So this is the picture we're getting here. God is as close to the chaos of pre-creation as he can get, and he is infusing it with his life-giving Spirit. So notice this something's happening. There's this feeling of building anticipation. And then in verse 3, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light, and God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. So this idea of good, is God making a moral appraisal of the light in this instance? Is he saying, this is good, and what's he doing here? Is he making a moral appraisal? Or is he making a functional observation that this is good, this works appropriately, this unit of time is what I intend for it to be? And God said, so when he says, and God said, this is the first of 10 speech acts in the creation narrative. So the number 10 signifies testimony, law, completeness of order. Can we think of anything else that is significant with the number 10? There's 10 commandments. So in verse 3-6, we see the first example of when God says, when God says, let there be light. So what is God doing? He is creating a unit of time. He is creating and bringing order before the sun and the moon come into play. So Tim Mackey from the Bible Project says this. He says, in Genesis 1:5, we are told what is being created. The light is called day, and the darkness is called night. These are not material entities, but periods of time. Light here is not a thing that is brought into existence at a specific moment in time. Rather, on day one, the order of time is being named into meaningful, functional existence. God is separating light from dark. And God contains the darkness. So we need to remember that what this idea would have meant to the ancient Near Eastern mind. He doesn't do away with it completely. He contains it. So the purposeful functionality of creation is completely contingent on God's divine presence. God has to be present in order for creation to function as it should, ongoing and for all of time. Okay, so the reason we are experiencing day and night now is because God has interwoven his being into the fabric of creation. Okay, it's this repeatable experience. We don't wonder, I don't know if I'm going to have a day tomorrow. I don't know. I'm just not sure if it's going to come, if tomorrow's going to come. No, it's something that we look for because we know that it's coming. So this is before the sun and the moon come into play. Why? Because God himself is the source of light in this narrative. So think about what that would have meant to those who worship the sun and the moon. God is making it clear that even the things that other people worship as gods, I am sovereign over. I determine their purpose, demonstrating God's preeminence in all things. The day is the most basic unit of time, the thing that we barely give any thought, and we know that it's coming. We're confident that it's coming. So let's look at verse 6. It says, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. I just think of like this happening. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Weird. So you probably begin to notice some repetitive words and phrases in this text. So expanse in the English is the English word we use for sky, but in Hebrew, this word is rakia. You guys answered some questions about that. And it gives the impression of a hammered out dome. That's what this word means, or that's what they would have understood, that this is a hammered out dome that is holding up the waters above and making an expanse from the waters below. So understand this, God has created a unit of time, and in this context, what he's doing here is he's creating space. So God is creating space that he's going to fill, but what we need to notice here is the power that God utilizes to separate the chaotic waters for life to flourish. As the darkness is separated from light, God separates the chaotic waters. When we start from the beginning of the narrative, some of our categories might start getting messed with because for the majority of us, our understanding of heaven is not this expanse idea. It's something else. It's something that we've grown up with. But I want to invite you to allow the narrative to shape your understanding rather than your understanding to shape the narrative. So what is God revealing to this original audience? Ask yourself that question. What does he want them to know? One of the words that stood out to me the most as I was studying was this word separate. Separate. There are two things we need to continue to be aware of. God is the one who is separating, indicating his intimate involvement in ordering creation as he orders time and space. But what I want you to likewise notice, what is not separated. We tend to make distinctions from physical and spiritual, but for the ancient Near Eastern mind, the physical and the spiritual would have been intimately connected. This narrative is carefully weaving together an understanding of the spiritual and the physical that is inextricably linked. Okay, so let's look. This is our last set of verses that we're going to talk about for this section. And it says this, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seeds, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was was evening and there was morning, the third day. So the first 3 days of creation lay a foundation for a biblical cosmology that will work its way through the remainder of the biblical story. So let me say that in a different way. The first 3 days of creation are telling us how does this universe work? How does the universe work? Based on these first 3 days, and how does that flow throughout the rest of the biblical story? And this understanding, taking these thoughts and ideas that are unpacked here and seeing them weave throughout the rest of the biblical story, is what we call biblical theology. Hey, we're all theologians in this place tonight. Okay, so this tells us heaven and earth are mirror realities. You have day 1 and day 3, light and dark, and water and land. So when God separates light from darkness, with God being the source of that light, it creates the most basic condition necessary for God's plan of life to flourish. Okay? So you have the light and the dark, and it's creating time. Okay? And then you have the separation of the chaotic waters from the land that creates the space necessary for God's plan of life to flourish. So you have light and dark, and you have waters and land, okay? God's conflict, pushing back the darkness, containing the darkness, is the foundational image of spiritual conflict that underlies the story of the Bible. Let me say that again. So God pushing back the darkness, him coming into creation, himself bringing the light of who he is into creation, is the foundational image of spiritual conflict that underlies the story of the Bible. So similarly, God and humanity's conflict with the chaos waters can function as an image of the human conflict. I'm sure you guys can think of another story in the Bible where God parts the Red Seas. He parts the waters as the as the Israelites are leaving Egypt. There's this idea of human conflict that is happening. So there's a metaphorical theme here with darkness indicating spiritual conflict and chaos waters indicating human conflict. So as God separates light from dark and water from land, there is implicit victory in these acts. God is already proclaiming who he is. There's implicit victory in these acts that display God's sovereignty and power through him speaking. Okay? So in Psalm 74, the psalmist is saying, in the midst of war and our enemies, remember your people. So he's crying out to God in Psalm 74. This is a psalm that is written in the time of war. And he connects this psalm where he's crying out for God to hear them in the midst of their enemies to God's act of creation. So I want to read that together, or I'm going to read it for you. And then we are going to go ahead and take a little bit of a break. But that means I have to find Psalms in my Bible. It's in the middle somewhere. Okay. All right, Psalm 74. I'm going to read verses 10 through 17. The psalmist is saying this: how long, O God, is the foe to scoff? Is the enemy to revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the fold of your garment and destroy them. Yet God, my King, is working from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. I lost my place. Okay, verse 13. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the water. We're going to get to that day. You crushed the heads of the Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks, and you dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day. Yours also the night. You have established the heavenly lights and the sun. You have fixed all the boundaries of the earth and you've made summer and winter. This idea, did you guys know, did you have any idea that there's this kind of something is building here? There's an anticipation that's happening, and there's much more going on than any of us realize. But that's exactly what Moses, the biblical author, wanted to communicate to the people of Israel, that your God is powerful. And he has intimately woven himself into the fabric of creation.